Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Temple Mount, the location where both biblical temples once stood, became yet again a source of tension in the region, as the bloodiest violence was recorded in the past month since the last surge of October 2015, which claimed the lives of dozens of people. To further discuss this topic, I'm joined here in the studio by Colonel in Reserve Dr. Reuven Berko, who is a columnist at the Israeli-Palestinian Daily, Mr. Amir Oren, our TV7 analyst, Lieutenant Colonel in Reserve Reuven Ben Shalom, who is a cross-cultural analyst and columnist at the Jerusalem Post, and Ms. Paula Slier, who is the bureau chief for Russia Today in the Middle East. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of the current situation.
Well, as you remember, it all started exactly 3 weeks ago on the Friday, and it lasted 2 weeks with 8 people killed and dozens wounded. The killed were 2 Israeli police officers, 3 members of an Israeli family, and 3 Palestinians. And the real damage done, in addition to the lives lost, was in the intricate texture of inter-religious and international relations, especially between Jews and Muslims and between Israel and Jordan. And the remnant of this affair right now, as we are speaking, is in the Jordanian-Israeli relationship, where the Jordanians are demanding that the security guard who killed 2 Jordanians in a scuffle, but it's not really clear what happened there, but was evacuated to Israel, be investigated and probably charged before they allow the embassy staff to return to
Well, we'll touch base on this specifically later on. Dr. Berko, you have also, among your other professions over your enriched life, you've served as an advisor to the police with regard to Jerusalem, specifically also the volatile regions, including the Temple Mount. What can you tell us about the whole security measures that the Palestinians, as well as the Arab world, specifically Jordan in this instance, have so condemned when it comes to Israeli decisions in order to try and safeguard its own citizens and personnel?
First of all, let's speak about Jerusalem in the view of Palestinians, just to understand where the source of the tension is laid. Historically, there's never been a Palestinian state, so naturally, Jerusalem has never been a capital to a state that never was. But despite all this, Palestinians used to use Al-Aqsa Mosque as a lever to political demands. And that's why it's not new that they have murdered 2 policemen in the Aqsa Mosque. They, for long years, even before the establishment of Israel, used to take Al-Aqsa in order to create a conflict between Judaism and Islam in order to move Palestinian mob against the Israeli existence. So what we saw is a repeat of what we have witnessed for many years all along the history, including my personal, as you well said, experience in Jerusalem for 10 years as an advisor for the commander of Jerusalem police along this period. So this is one thing, the cynical use of this holy place as a place to gather weapons, cocktail bottles, stones to be thrown on the wall, on the wall in which Jews are praying. Unfortunately, this time it cost 2 policemen, Israeli policemen, and as a result of this, the Israeli government, in consulting with the police, tried to establish a new arrangements through which this act cannot be repeated any longer by the magnetic security barriers. And they objected it. Why? God knows. They themselves, Palestinians, mainly the Muslim movement, the Muslim Brothers, under the headline of the Islamic movement, objected it despite the fact that they all the time claim that the Al-Aqsa Mosque is in danger. So this is another step to strengthen Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, about Jordan, one sentence.
No, I will come back to Jordan. Dr. Paula, I'd like to ask you, Ms. Slier. There have been checkups in all holy sites across the world. If you go into the Vatican or you go into Mecca for that sake, you do go through security barriers. They make sure that nobody has explosives on him or a knife, for that matter, to be able to be used for terrorist actions or so on. What is such a challenge for the Arab world to see this security barriers being installed by Israel when it comes to the Temple Mount?
Well, Jonathan, if I can answer your question by saying I spent the better part of 2 weeks at the confrontations. I was there day in and day out and asking that exact same question to Palestinians, particularly those who were the protesters on the ground. Their concern is that it changes the status quo. So the situation as it exists is that Jordan administers the site, Israel provides security, but no more than that. The concern was that by starting to do this, and now there's a discussion, well, let's take away the metal detectors, let's bring in handheld devices, let's bring in smart cameras, let's maybe bring in Jordanians in civilian clothing, all of these kind of things. For them, for people who go to the mosque, has a very real concern that Israel wants sovereignty over this site, and that Israel wants to perhaps change things, allow Jewish worshippers to come. Now, it might sound far-fetched, when you said the comment, well, every site has security, why not the Al-Aqsa Mosque? But it is a genuine concern that people there expressed. I do want to add, though, that the situation was used, particularly by groups like Hamas and sheikhs that urged people to go to the streets and protest. Most of the youngsters that I met and interviewed were not necessarily religious. A lot of them were secular. A lot of them were inspired by posts that had been put on Facebook and on social media, or that they themselves were posting. So you have hundreds of people, and we still have that situation now, who are saying they're prepared to die for Al-Aqsa, which is what happened in the incident in Halamish settlement where 3 Israelis were killed. And so you have a religious issue that has become a political issue. And it's not so much an issue of security, but an issue of, well, how does Israel deal with the fallout in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, while at the same time not being seen to have stepped down because the security has been removed, and at the same time provide good security to worshippers going to the site.
Dr. Ben Shalom, Colonel Ben Shalom, when we're talking about the current situation, there are 2 words that I would like to focus on. One is sovereignty. Is Israel truly sovereign over the Temple Mount, which it claims to be? And the second one, to what extent is this indeed a religious fight or a fight of national values?
Well, I don't want to even discuss the issue of sovereignty, because I think it's used, just like all the other excuses, as the spark to trigger the tension. I think this has nothing to do with security measures. I think the Israeli government should not have put those security measures in place. Not that we don't need security measures. Of course we do. We need to do it wisely. This tension, of course, has nothing to do with the Temple Mount. It has to do with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
But we're talking here about 2 police officers who've been murdered by people who enter the compound with firearms, not just a knife or something. It was concealed firearms. They ran in, they fired and killed 2 officers. Isn't this a point of concern for the Israeli police to try and make changes in order to make sure this doesn't happen again?
Absolutely. But Israeli mentality, Israeli culture is always, something happens, we need to respond, and we do need to respond now. And second, because we're sovereign, nobody's going to tell us what to do. So we do it. And then that is used as an excuse, as the spark for the tension, instead of saying, wait, by the way, other leaders in the Middle East do this perfect. We should learn from Bashar al-Assad. Something happens, you wait, you think, you talk to your advisors, consultations. You say, okay, I want security measures in place. Let's talk to Jordan. Let's talk to the Waqf. Maybe we'll come from them. Make it them understand that it's their interest. Maybe we'll do it in 2 months. But always we say, no, something happened. We respond now, which is why the next war in Lebanon, by the way, is not up to us. It's up to the other side. All they need to do is spark it, and we respond because we're Israelis. So I think this was not a wise decision by the Israeli government. And it's not that we don't need security measures. We definitely need them. It's impossible to see a place like this without security measures. Someday, somebody may try to blow up the Temple Mount. We better protect that site, but not this way.
Mr. Oren.
Of course, it's unjust. If you look at the larger scheme of things, it's unjust and unjustified to blame Israel because the chain of events started with smuggling weapons into the compound and then taking them out and then firing at the policemen. It could have been done the other way around. It could have been done by people entering from outside because the police were not inside the compound. And this was done by Israelis, not by the Palestinians who for the last 50 years have worshipped under Israeli control. But be that as it may, the status quo in the Middle East is holy. It is also true within Israel. You have secular and religious, and you have the status quo in Jerusalem, in Bnei Brak, and other communities. And it doesn't really matter what the historical context is. Once it is in place, once it is temporary, it becomes effective. And then if you try to change one stone, 1 gram, then all hell breaks loose. So Reuven is right. Israel should have considered the effect of what has been happening, and the issue of sovereignty has never been resolved. Nobody in the world recognizes Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem in general, including the Western Wall, including the Jewish holy sites, let alone the Muslim or Christian holy sites. So it was not wise for Israel to use this argument. We are sovereign, we'll do what we see fit, because nobody, and especially not Jordan and Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries and the Palestinians recognize it. And it should have been done in consultation with the religious authorities, the Waqf. A mediator should have been called in order to present an Israeli-inspired formula as some third parties. But apparently the Israeli decision-making mechanism has been exposed as so weak that Israel has changed its mind several times over this crisis and lost not only face and prestige, but also some of its deterrence value.
Dr. Berko, when we're looking at the withdrawal of Israel from the decision to install those security mechanisms that weren't put in place, is this not losing face? Is it not losing some kind of prestige, as Mr. Oren has just stated? And at the same time, wouldn't have Jordan be more responsive to a situation where its responsibility is, of course, to take care of the Temple Mount to a certain degree on the religious aspect of things, to go and actually put something together as a joint effort to make sure that security is preserved?
Not at all. In addition to all my sins, I was also an officer in paratroopers. So I can tell you that even in the field, one can change his tactic or strategic if he faces some difficulties. But nothing of these matters was damaged. But allow me to mention one interesting point, that even in this very day, the Israelis, the Jews all over the world are now carrying the memory of the ruin of 2 temples. In this very day, we call it Tisha B'Av. In these days, the 2 temples were ruined by, first of all, by Babylonians and later on by Romans. Remains of it can be seen by all Europeans who've just claimed not to admit the sovereignty of the Israelis on Jerusalem, and UNESCO, who ignores the rights and the connection to the Jews. Christianity is built on the story of Jesus on the Temple Mount of the Jews. So the story of ignoring or not ignoring is temporary. For us, we are the sovereigns. It's on Titus Gate in Rome. Everybody who wonders what are the ties of the Israelis to the Temple Mount in general, not only to the wall, to Jerusalem, to the mount itself, etc., etc. This is one point. Another point is understanding the arena we are in now. Everybody can, I want to draw attention to the fact that none of the Arab states around us have taken its embassy out of Israel as protesting what is all going on. We could easily see how do you call it? The hands was rolling around of Turkey, Qatar, and Muslim brothers, including Muslim brothers in Jordan, Egypt. Muslim brothers, the Islamic movement of the North.
Nevertheless, what I want to understand, though, Dr. Berko,
yes,
when we're talking specifically about the course of action of the Israeli government, where it took a rash decision to make proper security arrangements to make sure that this doesn't happen again, and then after seeing the security situation on the ground deteriorating, things have actually come to a point where they said, okay, we won't deal with the security now, we'll
That's
deal
what
with it
I'm
later.
on my way to explain. If you see the efforts of Islamic movement to raise a conflict between Jews and Islam in the context of the chaos that occurring all over Israel, you shouldn't supply the cause for those who want this to happen. And second point is the relationship with Jordan. Yes, we consider the relationship with Jordan very critical and important. And that's why Israel has responded to the request of the Jordanian to remove it. This relationship between us and the Jordanian is dramatic because Jordan is the representative of the Islamic world for us. They are the one who run the show from administrative point of view in Al-Aqsa Mosque. But sovereignty is for Israel. There's no one who can claim for sovereignty. We can change our tactical movements according to challenges. And we saw that the Islamic movement pay the Murtazikin and Murtazikat, those who come and protest for money. We understood that it can change the equilibrium of all the area of the Middle East. Why should we draw the anger of people who kill each other all over the Islamic and Arab world towards us? It was just a matter of a smart move.
It was a calculated decision, also according to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Ms. Slier, do you think that Israel's image is currently damaged? Of course, as Dr. Berko said, none of the Arab neighbors, including Jordan and Egypt, have not asked their diplomatic missions to withdraw from Israel. Nevertheless, a lot of tension is still mounting up and still there, where Israel is trying to maneuver within this situation currently in order to come out, at least with its head held high to a certain degree.
I think the response from the Arab world and the Muslim world in particular has been quite muted. I think we saw protests happening in Turkey, we saw protests in Jordan, but we didn't see massive outright condemnation of Israel in the mainstream Arab press. And I think, on the one hand, perhaps this was a surprise for Netanyahu. Maybe he was expecting the moderate Sunni states to perhaps maybe not support him, but maybe not to criticize him.
They are threatened by Islamic movements as well.
100%.
That's the point.
I mean, and in terms of regional tensions, what is happening is you have this whole play between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Hamas, who was motivating a lot of the protests. And I think that Saudi Arabia didn't want to be seen to be supporting Hamas and its call for people to go to the mosque and protest. On the other hand, you had a country like Iran coming out with all the right statements against Israel, but then you had Sunni Islam saying, well, you know, the mosque is our third holiest site, it's not for the Iranians to comment. So you have an interplay in the Arab world between the countries themselves in terms of how they respond. What I do want to say is that Israel, and particularly Netanyahu, has been making a lot of mention about the growing relationship between Israel and moderate Sunni states. And yet, when you see something like this, at the end of the day, most of the states, the Palestinian issue is still very close to their hearts. And I think it's a miscalculation on the Israeli side if they think that ever they will put that aside and come to Israel's side in any kind of conflict. So the response might have been muted, but it's not to say that, for example, King Salman of Saudi Arabia, he was putting pressure on Israel through the Americans, but he didn't issue any statements. Doesn't mean to say he supports the Israelis. He has to be very careful of the Islamic population in his own country, of even the secular Arabs, of a potential another Arab Spring. The Arab Spring showed the power of the Arab population to go to the streets and demonstrate. And I think the Arab world and Arab leaders are very cautious and wary of that and will be very slow to come out in public statements on the issue. And that's what we saw.
Colonel Ben Shalom?
I think if this was a classic confrontation of game theory, I think they won. And it's okay. As Israelis, we can say sometimes they won, and now we should learn our lessons. I see you don't agree with me. What I mean they won, I think the masses understood their power. They see that by sitting outside the gates and praying for 2 weeks, mostly, by the way, peacefully, right? It was not all violent attacks. Ultimately, Israel folded in stages, but ultimately Israel folded. So I think we can learn from this, and it's okay. We're allowed to learn. By the way, we're better sometimes because we learn from our mistakes. I think this was a mistake. As far as the long run in the Temple Mount, I think that the status quo is in a way holy, and we have to continue to stress it. We should say even here, does Israel have any aspirations to change the status quo? Absolutely not. Do we want to secretly build a third temple? I certainly can promise you that no, right? But this will always be used as an excuse. So what we need to do is show them that we respect the place, stop these foolish arguments about who was here first, and we don't have to prove to everybody that the temple here was 2,000 years ago. Also respect that the place as it is now exists for 1,400 years, and that is the mosque that's written in the Quran and not the other one that some of us try to say it is. And we respect that very much. It's a holy site for them, holy site for us. And I believe that we can, in this kind of rhetoric, at least make it that this will not be the next spark in the near future.
I'd like to touch base on the Israeli-Jordanian relations currently. Of course, the situation in the embassy where Israel, of course, says that the security guard there was attacked by one of the people who came to fix something, and then he responded by firing at the attacker and killed both him and the landlord of the building at the same time. Nevertheless, it's a lot deeper than that. There was a lot of mounting tension concerning the Temple Mount and concerning the arrangements there, because as part of the peace treaty, Jordan has the responsibility of the Temple Mount currently, and Israel has, as we mentioned here on the show earlier, the security arrangements under its control. But as part of the peace treaty, and it's specifically mentioned in Article 9, subsection 3, there is also a responsibility of Israel and Jordan together to take care of the interfaith and making sure that all religions, monotheistic religions, specifically Christians, Jews, and Muslims, will have the opportunity to worship there, something that is not happening because of that status quo we're talking about. How is this all coming together?
There is no real bilateral relationship between Israel and Jordan. It's multilateral, at least a triangle with the Palestinians, and perhaps even Egypt and Syria should be considered, as well as Lebanon, because of the Palestinian refugees, some of whom were expelled from Jordan and went to Lebanon. And the peace treaty with Jordan was signed only after the Oslo agreements, because King Hussein first disengaged from the West Bank, saying, I am no longer responsible for what is happening between the Israelis and the Palestinians who were my subjects. Now you Israelis deal with them directly. And eventually what happened was that Israel had the Oslo Accords, and then Hussein signed the peace agreement which you cited. But there is always the Palestinian-Jordanian dimension to this relationship, which one has to bear in mind, because the Jordanians want, as well as Israel, want to keep the Jordan River as their security boundary. They want the Palestinian state, once it is established, to be stuck between Israel and the Hashemite kingdom, and they are fearful of the Palestinians no less than the Israelis are. Now, the Jordanians, as well as the Egyptians, are the only Arab countries with peaceful relations in Israel and with embassies in Amman, Tel Aviv, and Cairo. And the paradox here is that rather than the Jordanians taking their ambassador out in protest for what happened on Temple Mount, the Israelis, for some reason, panicked and took out not only the security guard who was involved in this problem, but also the entire embassy staff. And now they are dependent on the Jordanian goodwill to bring them back. Now, one should know that Amman is probably the most difficult foreign service post for Israel, even though it is barely half an hour ride from the Israeli border.
Mutual. It's mutual.
It is the most threatened post, and at most times, all or almost all of the embassy personnel go back for the weekend to Israel. There is no continuous presence there, but for symbolic reasons, the Israeli flag is there. It is very important for Jordan to have an Israeli embassy. And the fact that Netanyahu took them all out and now has to pay something, including the judicial process which the security guard must undergo, only shows the weakness of the personal relationship between King Abdullah and Netanyahu, not the relationship between the security establishments of the countries, which is excellent, but only the problem that a politician with a Western orientation, such as Netanyahu, who is magnificent when he talks to Americans, but can't bring himself to behave in the same manner as expected in the Middle East when he approaches King Abdullah.
Dr. Berko.
One can think that personal relationship is the only thing. I would say
In the Middle East.
in the Middle East, I would say that interest is the most important thing. And speaking about Jordan, I would put the story of the embassy aside, because the strategic point is what happened in Temple Mount. Listen, in Saudi Arabia, the king needs Mecca and Medina, Haramain Sharifain, as a point of strengthening the legitimacy of its own rule. This is Islamic rule. The same is the story of King Abdullah from Jordan. He needs the holy places as part of his legitimacy as one who belongs to the Hashemite family, the family of the Prophet Muhammad. So nobody needs or intend to take this out of him except for the Palestinians. We as Israelis consider Al-Aqsa Mosque as a very holy place for Muslims. Nobody planned in Israel, formally and informally, to change the situation forever. This is till God changes it, it will remain as it is. So the whole suspicion that Israel has plans to ruin it, they invaded it. Jordan needs us, we need Jordan. Palestinians negated in the crisis. They are not part of the equilibrium. They will never be a part of equilibrium because the story actually is political. They try to turn it into a religious one. Mm-hmm. The story is who is the one whose sovereignty upon Jerusalem is, they claim that Palestinians are, we are sure that we are because of history, biblical claims, etc.
And that's a whole other story that we'll have to touch on, Ms. Slier.
I think it just points to the fact of how emotive the whole story of Al-Aqsa Mosque is. It has power to recruit people. It is hugely emotional and important and abstract to most Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza and who can't come. And I think Israel will need to turn itself around so that it's not seen as having lost this battle, but at the same time, it will need to find some kind of solution to improving security.
We didn't even talk about the significance of the Temple Mount for the Israeli population and Jewish population. Ben Shalom?
Well, absolutely. Even though most of the time we try to give excuses and explain history as if we have something that we need to prove. Your question about Jordan, by the way, I say don't believe a word you see coming out of the mouths of the Jordanian leadership. That's all rhetoric for political reasons. It has nothing to do with the extremely good relations we have, promoting mutual goals. Unfortunately, it's not pleasant to hear that, and sometimes I wish it was different, but that's just the way it is. My last recommendation, by the way, is for the Jordanian leadership to initiate, not now, in a few months, to initiate their own security measures in Temple Mount, because that place needs to be protected, because the extremists, who knows on what side, will someday try to blow that place up, and I hope not literally, but blow it up again using as a political spark, and we need security measures.
This is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Reuven Berko, Mr. Amir Oren, Colonel Reuven Ben Shalom, and Ms. Paula Slier for coming here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.